Okay, thank you. So the topic of the hour is the economic and the legal issues related to climate superfund legislation. And we have some really amazing people here to learn from, Claire Brown and Maya Golden-Krasner. So grateful for their time. And if you wouldn't mind in the chat writing your name and where you're zooming in from, that would be great. We don't have, unfortunately, quite enough time for everybody to introduce yourselves, but we're glad you're here and would love to know where you're joining from. So without further ado. So times are intense, and I just shared this quote because it feels like the list of things that we need to be working on is just growing by the minute. So remembering that, none of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. And this is an important something to focus on and be a part of. So in the interest of doing what we can with the time we have, we're glad you're here. And very importantly, before we wrap up today, we will share 4 very specific ways for you to join in if this theme and working to advance something like this in California, if this calls to you, we have really specific ways for you to do just that. So glad you're with us. And the way we'll spend our hour together is first we will learn from Claire Brown about the economic considerations of polluter pays Superfund type bills. Then we will learn from Maya Golden-Krasner about the legal considerations of that. And then we have a very generous 15 minutes allocated for us to have discussion and questions and answers and, really customized towards what interests each of you the most. And then, like I promised, we will finish with 4 really specific ways to get involved if this is something that you believe in and want to help advance in California. So Climate Health Now is hosting this, and there's a lot of different organizations that are part of the work that we're working on and talking about. But Climate Health Now, just to name, is organizing and mobilizing the California health community to advocate for equitable systems level climate action in California. And we're part of a big coalition working on the Climate Superfund here in California, but this is our particular mission. And I'm just going to frame briefly with what, there was a Climate Superfund that passed in Vermont and also in New York. And I just wanted to frame the discussion for what's currently being discussed in Sacramento and across the state is the Climate Superfund in California would direct the California EPA to complete a climate cost study, which would quantify the damages related to greenhouse gas emissions, climate pollution in California retroactively. So 20 years in the past that it would, or sorry, this is looking forward to the damage that climate change is already causing to the state. So it would estimate the damages. You can be sure that the LA fires would be part of that. And then the California EPA would identify responsible parties who contributed very significantly to the damage that we're seeing and the warming that we're already having in the past. So if they contributed to the climate pollution in the past, they would be called responsible parties, and if they work in California. And that's how they would identify who would put in to a climate superfund. And then lastly, that big pot of money called the Climate Superfund would be used to transition to clean energy, transition to, resilience hubs.
I call somebody else. Yes.
Sorry. And it would be earmarked, 40% of that money would be earmarked for the communities hardest hit by climate changes. So this is the most bare bones outline, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody had a sense for that framework, which I believe is similar to what was passed in New York and Vermont. So, and then, importantly, this would be estimated to generate approximately 150 with a billion over the course of 20 years. So roughly $7.5 billion each year. So we're talking about an incredible amount of money. and really important in, times where most states have a budget deficit. So that is the background. And then the last piece that really inspired this conversation today and inviting Claire and Maya to join together is, I don't think it's actually in a play, but I just wanted to show, how many ads there are talking about the cost of gas in especially California. And it's going up, right? The cost of living is very expensive. And the oil lobby is screaming about how a polluter's pay bill would increase the cost of gas in California. And that is their primary way of building opposition to something like this, is the threat that it will increase the cost of gas. And part of the heart of today's conversation is about what affects the cost of gas, because it's not just the oil lobby deciding they're going to increase the cost, but it's a really complicated, number that has a lot of different factors. So we're here in part to be able to respond to that really significant threat from the oil lobby that they're going to increase the cost of gas, because nobody wants that for anybody, because most people are not doing, no, the inflation is affecting everybody. So we want to be able to discuss that and engage with that concern in a really educated, well-founded way. And that's part of what we're here to learn about today. So sorry, I'm not going to play that. Going to skip the slide. Okay, so I am really excited to introduce our two guest speakers today. So the first is Maya Golden-Krasner, who is a senior attorney and deputy director of the Climate Law Institute at the Center for Biological Diversity. Before joining the center, Maya was a staff attorney for the Communities for Better Environment, CBE, where she advocated for environmental justice in California's low-income communities of color. She's also an adjunct lecturer at the UCLA School of Law, where she has taught environmental justice law and California environmental law. She has a law degree from UCLA and a master's in U.S. environmental and legal history from University of Wisconsin-Madison, a bachelor's from the University of Washington, also my alma mater, and she currently lives in Altadena. And there's nothing theoretical about this. When Maya and Claire and I were preparing, Maya was staying actually in a hotel because of her being affected by the Altadena fire. So the stakes are real and personal. And Claire Brown has a PhD. She's an economics professor, and she coordinates the Climate and Society Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Claire's student research teams are working on the California climate equity policies and other works related to national policies to creating a sustainable, equitable economy. Her most recent book, Buddhist Economics, I love this subtitle, An Enlightened Approach to the Dismal Science. And this book provides her economic framework that integrates global sustainability, shared prosperity, and care for the human spirit. So we are, sorry, I forgot the picture. So these are our speakers, and I will pass it to Claire, who's going to present now.
You're muted.
I'm trying to share screen. Oh, now it just popped up. Okay. It's really good to be here with you today. And I'm really excited to talk to you about the Superfund Act, because it's really important for us to find a way to support this to help the planet and the public health in California. So I'm from UC Berkeley, where, as you know, my research team has been working on this. Now, we all know, just to remind ourselves, that we're underseeing already enormous damages from climate change. And so we know that these past CO2 emissions are damaging our health as well as our quality of life. Now, from an economic viewpoint, it's really important to understand externalities. And this is when the firm's cost of their operations are actually passed on to the public. And so in this case, the fossil fuel companies haven't had to pay for their emissions, and we've had to pay for it as the public, first with our health, then with our taxes to cover public costs to disasters and with living with air pollution. And then we have our expenses that are related to our private property damages, higher insurance costs. So it's like we're paying for the pollution that fossil fuels companies caused, and they should have been paying for according to market economics. So let's then step back and say a lot of the things that we're looking at today is the issue of affordability. Who pays? So I want to remind you that affordability includes both private costs, those are the costs that we all pay in the marketplace for whatever we're buying. But we also are paying with our health and our property damages, with our higher taxes, and these are all called social costs. And affordability includes both of those, private cost and social cost. The polluters love to pass on social costs to customers because it makes their operations cheaper. Hey, the public's paying for a lot of the operations, and it makes our profits higher when we work in oil, gas, and coal. So you can understand that, of course, the big emitters want to pass on these social costs so that they don't have to pay for them. So, 1 second there. So let's ask this big question. Does the Superfund fee increase gas prices? I'm going to give you 3 basic reasons why gas prices were not affected by the Superfund fee. But I just want to remind you that also we should think about all affordability, not just gas prices, because the Superfund fee will reduce our cost of taxpayers and as private individuals because we want to find ways to actually improve public health and reduce and mitigate climate damages. Also, remember that 40% of the revenues are going to go to the at-risk communities who have had the highest social cost and truly need to help improve their residents' well-being. So here are the 3 reasons why Superfund fees do not increase prices at the pump. First of all, there's no impact on the global oil price. You can see the graph that global oil is quite volatile. No company can manipulate the global oil price. And furthermore, the price of crude oil sets the wholesale price of oil. And then the price of oil ends up being 45% of the price of gasoline at the pump. So there's no connection between the Superfund fee and the global oil price. Secondly, we have branded and unbranded gas stations. Now, most people have no idea what this means, but basically it means the oil majors, you can see them up there. There's 7 of them who actually operate gas stations in California. Now, they have the so-called branded gas, but there's also, and they have 56% of the market, but it's been declining. We also have unbranded stations, and this also includes what they call hypermarts, but we can just call it unbranded. And we have a lot of those, almost half the market is unbranded gas, and they have lower prices because they compete with the branded gas stations. So in a competitive market, the branded gas, trust me, they have their prices as high as they can get them relative to competing against unbranded gas. And the Superfund fee has no direct impact on the price of gasoline because of this competition, because only unbranded gas stations, these 7, would have any way to talk about, oh, our costs are higher. They're not higher. And we'll go on and tell you why, because this is really important. That the California refineries also have legal constraints. We only
Claire,
have 4 oil majors which sell crude oil. I'm sorry, what? Is there a problem?
I think we lost you just for the past like 20 seconds.
Oh, okay, yeah, there seemed to be something happening on the screen. Oh, Or can you hear?
It just broke up a little bit for me. Maybe
Hear
if
me
you could,
now?
yes, maybe if you want to start again, I think start over on slide 3, just to be sure we don't miss anything. Claire, I'm worried that we are not hearing you. Maybe do you want to go off?
Okay, this isn't a problem actually.
There. I think you're back. Maybe sometimes if you want to go off video, sometimes that can help. And then if you could start over on this slide.
Okay, I don't see my video, but can you take me off off?
I think you're back. There, and I took your video off just in case it helps.
Okay, thank you. So my apologies to everyone because these cost constraints are very important. So the refineries also cannot pass on any cost in when they sell their crude oil and their refined oil because it's not an operational cost. Let me be really clear that no fee is paid, no Superfund fee is paid by local refineries and gas stations. Now remember, we have 7 major oil companies that have gas stations and 4 major oil companies that have refineries, but they aren't paying any fee in California at the local refineries or gas stations. The Superfund fee is paid by the headquarters because the Superfund fees are based upon global emissions and the responsibility of the responsible companies for making those emissions, but the actual damages are only priced in California. So that's very important in terms of what the total damages would be and then who's pay, the headquarters of the multinational companies. So in this way, the fee does not impact cost, output, or jobs. And remember that we're going to have benefits from the revenues. We will increase green jobs with really good investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and other high return programs. So I also want to point out quickly that the employment in the refineries is affected by domestic demand. That means California demand and by exports, and exports mean to other states and countries. So you look in the graph and you see that actually the demand of oil and gas has declined in California. And when that happens, the refineries start exporting their produced refined products, which is basically gasoline and diesel and aviation fuel, outside the state into other countries. And by the way, the oil fields in California are drying up, and only 24% of the crude oil going to refineries comes from California oil fields. So exports are keeping the refinery output higher than the state demand, and at this point, the exports are 30% of the refinery output. So I've put more information in the slides that you can go back and look at when you have more time. So that I want to mention also, because there's a lot of discussion about the announcement of closing 2 refineries. And a lot of, well, big oil's trying to say, see how hard it is to do business in California. We're closing our refineries. But actually, if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see that the 2 refineries that are closing have really bad histories of illegal toxics that are putting into the air and even into the water. Phillips 66 in Wilmington, it was indicted with 6 felony counts in 2024 for dumping dirty wastewater. They were also sued by the Air Quality Management District for their persistent toxic emissions, and that was in 2020. And then if you go to Vallejo and Benicia, not far from where I live, they were fined $81 million just last year for their toxic emission since 2003. And these emissions were known but not reported by the refinery, and they took no steps to stop the illegal emissions. And then they had a major fire in May 2025 that further caused community harm. And so they're now in the process of trying to figure out how to get going again before, even though they threatened to shut down. So let me quickly go over that big oil has ability to pay, because you'll also hear, oh, this is too much, we can't afford this from big oil. Well, actually, Chevron, Shell, Total, BP, Exxon, they spent $114 billion in just 2023 on dividends and share repurchases to enrich their shareholders and their executives. Big oil social cost of their past operations, and instead they want to invest to expand drilling and refinery, and which is now should be stopped and is a bad investment, and also stock buybacks. So let's then remember that the Superfund revenues, how they're spent, is really important. And for your community group, as people who work on public health and individual health, we really do need these revenues to support programs to reduce climate damages and improve public health. And communities will be involved in making those decisions. The polluters finally need to help pay for their operation costs that have endangered our health and our survival. And we are not paying with higher gas prices. So let me invite all of you to find ways that you can work in your communities, you can work with Climate Health Now to help make this a reality so that we can have revenues from the big emitters to make our state so safer and certainly healthier and more resilient. So I invite you to help work on this bill, because it's really important for us to find a way to raise these revenues from the big emitters that cause the damages so that we can all be healthier and safer and help protect our planet. I look forward to your questions, and I really thank you for being here.
Yay! Thank you, Claire. Eric, there will definitely be a Q&A later in this meeting. I'm wondering if we could take like 2 questions now, and then we'll have time for much more after we hear from Maya. Would that be okay, Claire?
Of course, I love questions.
Okay, great. So I think I would love to take them from the chat. So the first one was so Kate Harrison, hello, mentioned that in a recent lobby day, there was discussion about how off-brand gas companies, like retail gas stations, that they buy their gas from the majors that would have the Superfund applied. Can you speak to that part, Claire?
Okay, right. So the way the retail gas market works in California is everybody gets their gas from California refineries, and it's up to the California quality standards, and then they all buy it. And if it's branded, they throw in a few little proprietary things that they say make a difference, but most studies have shown actually that's not true. Gas is gas, and so it doesn't matter if you buy it from branded or unbranded stations. But what's really important is that none of the refineries that supply our gasoline are going to be paying a fee. The fees are paid by the multinationals, and they're actually quite small compared to the profitability of the multinational companies. But there is no local refinery that's paying a fee. And so only the carbon majors that are responsible, and that's if they're fossil fuel companies, they have global emissions of greater than 1 billion tons over the period, and if they do business in California, which they all do. So Cal EPA will be figuring this all out. It's just going to, first we just have to pass the bill, and then we people do all of this, they'll tell you exactly who the companies are that are responsible and why, and then they'll take care of the attribution of emissions, which you'll learn about more later, and then they'll do the cost damage study, which actually isn't as advanced yet as the emissions study. But that's okay. California right now is doing an assessment study already of the cost of climate damages. So it'll all happen if we can just actually, at Berkeley, we use evidence and we use data, but big oil just keeps, I don't even know what, they'll come up with something else. Because we very diligently respond and say, no, that's not quite right. Here's actually how the market works, or this is, you're leaving out this is very important data. But they don't stop. They don't mind just telling you whatever they feel like as a fact.
Right.
And so I really like questions because it's really important that we come back with the evidence, because I think the lawmakers will listen to the evidence, and then we have to educate the public.
Yep, exactly. Thank you. I think let's maybe take one more and then we'll pass it to Maya to learn more. So this question, what prevents the companies, the responsible parties, like what are the limitations to how much they can increase the price themselves? Because I mean, everybody's scared of, they're saying they're going to pass the cost on, just pass it forward. So are these three reasons like the best response, you would say, Claire, to what we should say to that messaging that's being, paid for by the millions?
Yeah, see, I don't understand how they think about this cost. It's like you have to understand there are only 7 possible responsible companies that have gas stations. And then there are there are 4 refineries that have a product that they sell called gasoline or diesel. And so they aren't, and none of them are getting a fine. Their fee, rather, is not a fine. None of them are paying a fee. It is true that their parent companies will pay a fee on the damages in California, but the fee then reflects their addition to fossil emissions over the time period. So it's hard to say. I'm having a hard time because, you can't raise a price unless you have a product. And so we have gas here, but there are only 7 responsible companies and they aren't paying the fee. Their parent company is. We
Yeah.
have 4 refineries and same thing. So it's really important, I think, for people to understand how few companies are actually in California. None of them are paying a fee. There are a lot more fossil fuel companies globally that will be paying a fee on their past emissions because they caused a lot of damage in California.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is really enlightening, and I think there's a good amount of complexity to it. It's like related to the energy economy, which is why it's so hard to message in this soundbite world that we live in, and I think this is what we're up against. But you're right, it's about educating the decision makers, which we're working on. So let's go ahead and pass it to Maya, and then we do have a good amount of time allocated at the end to discuss more. So Maya, I'm going to do my best to read your mind, and the floor is yours.
Yay. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the legal issues that support the bill, and then also some of the arguments that you all may have been hearing from the fossil fuel industry and maybe also from policymakers who are parroting the fossil fuel industry, because as we were just saying, their talking points are simplistic and they can just assert them, but it's much more complicated for us to explain why these simplistic assertions are completely incorrect and just more disinformation. So basically this bill and all the polluter pays acts are based on the polluter pays principle. So like I would tell my kids, you make a mess, you clean it up. Fossil fuel companies have externalized their costs onto state gas taxpayers for decades without paying to fix the damage. And it's time to change that. So the polluter pays doctrine is actually the legal basis for many, many environmental laws, which serve as precedents for this act. Some examples are the Water Code and California's Health and Safety Code, which allow the state to recover costs that it pays to remediate past or even threatened water and hazardous waste pollution. And you all may be familiar with CERCLA, which also known as Superfund. That is a federal law, and that allows cost recovery for hazardous waste pollution from current and past owners and operators, transporters, and arrangers of hazardous waste. So one thing to note is that legal responsibility under CERCLA is very, very broad. So first of all, it's strict or regardless of fault. So similar to a Polluters Pay Act, a party can't simply just say it was not negligent or reckless or guilty or that it was operating according to industry standards. If any party dealt with some amount of the hazardous waste found at the site, that party is responsible. It's also retroactive. So the Polluters Pay Bill in California looks back to 1990 and says, okay, what were your emissions from 1990 to 2025 compared to global emissions? And looks at that ratio, that percentage, and that's the percentage of damages, of the cost damages that they'll be responsible for to the state of California. So once Cal EPA is going to do its cost study, and let's say, you know, X company is responsible for 5% of global emissions from 1990 to 2025, then they'll be responsible for that same percentage of the damages to the state. So CERCLA similarly is retroactive. The parties can be held liable for acts that happened even before Superfund's enactment in 1980, and there's no limit on the retroactivity, whereas here we're only going back to 1990. And I'll talk about why in a second. Liability is also joint and several. So any one party can be responsible for the entire cleanup of the site and other costs. And this is also more aggressive than polluters pay, under which companies are responsible only for their proportionate amount. Costs under CERCLA are not even just limited to cleanup, but it's all kinds of remediation, like damages to natural resources, like to a fishery, and costs of health assessments. So next slide. Another precedent that this one we've really been looking closely at, this is a Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Act. So since the 1990s, California has upheld and implemented this law that assesses compensatory fees against paint and gas producers. The Department of Public Health establishes the fee based on a company's historic market share responsibility for environmental lead contamination. Like polluters pay, this law exempts retailers of their products, and the fees are used for programs to screen and treat lead poisoning in children. The fee was upheld by the California Supreme Court in 1997, and the method of apportioning fees, which is very similar to what we're doing with polluters pay, was upheld by the California Court of Appeals in 2010. So in that case, Shell argued that the fee was an unconstitutional tax because it was based on a proportionate shares of environmental lead pollution, which leaded gasoline was most responsible for, and not cases of childhood lead poisoning, which it argued that lead paint companies were more responsible for because kids eat the paint chips. Shell also complained that it was unconstitutional that other industries that were likely responsible for childhood lead poisoning paid no fee at all. And here the court found that it was not unconstitutional the way they apportioned the fees. So DPH analyzed this historic use of lead paint and gasoline going back to 1929. And based on this analysis, calculated that the gas industry was responsible for 85% of environmental lead pollution, and the paint industry roughly 15%. And it didn't matter which industry was more responsible for specific lead poisoning cases. What mattered was the responsibility for lead pollution, putting the people at risk. Court also found that allocating fees only to the paint and gas industries, even though some other industries also emitted lead, was fine because these were overwhelmingly the largest historical consumers of lead in the stream of commerce, resulting in environmental lead contamination and subsequently resulting in ongoing and chronic exposure to children. So this is similar to the Polluters Pay Act, where the fossil fuel industry is overwhelmingly responsible for climate pollution, 90% of carbon dioxide, and resulting climate change has subsequently resulted in ongoing climate damages to California. Next slide. So some other examples that you guys may be familiar with is the black lung cases. So in 1976, the Supreme Court held that the Due Process Clause poses no bar to requiring a coal mine operator to provide compensation for a former miner's death or disability due to black lung disease arising out of their employment in the mines, even if the former miner terminated his employment in the industry before the act was even passed. Another example that you all may be familiar with is the California Tobacco Control Program. And so this is a little bit different than what we're doing here because that program was based on a tax, not what we're doing here, which is a compensatory charge based on pollution remediation principles. So in California, you need a 2/3 vote of the legislature or the public to pass a tax, which is very hard, but it was done with California's Tobacco Control Program. The program began in 1989 after a ballot measure or proposition in 1988, which increased the cigarette tax by 25 cents and dedicated 5 cents to fund tobacco control efforts. The programs aim to reduce tobacco use and change social norms around smoking. And then again, in November 2016, Californians overwhelmingly voted to raise tax on tobacco products, again, to fund ways to prevent youth from smoking and to fight the impact of tobacco on our state's residents. So this program and Polluters Pay do share similar types of goals for public health and climate health, respectively, and are dealing with very similar industries. So both big tobacco and big oil have known for decades and knew for decades that their products could harm and kill people, but they misled the public and policymakers to block regulation. But they do have slightly different goals. The tobacco program funds are mostly used to educate and counter disinformation to reduce tobacco use and create tobacco-free environments, whereas the Polluters Pay law is remedial as well as preventive to fund recovery and restoration. So it focuses less on education and other individual behavioral change and more on systemic changes, though those might affect behavioral changes, but bigger changes like in transportation, building decarbonization, distributed energy, and community resilience. So next slide. So some of the arguments you may hear, I'm just gonna kind of talk really quickly about. One of them is that we already have the climate nuisance cases. California is suing big oil and cities and counties are suing big oil. So that's, double counting that's already doing this. But we see this bill as distinct from and complementary to and doesn't affect on these ongoing lawsuits holding big oil accountable for its decades of gaslighting regarding the known and dire harm of their products and for creating a public nuisance. So first, the bill has a really strong savings clause so that it doesn't relieve polluters of liability or preempt any other remedies that the state or local governments or even individuals have in law. And we also have precedent here for proceeding on parallel tracks with the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Act. So after the legislature passed the act, local governments sued the paint industry for public nuisance, and the Court of Appeals granted relief for those claims and allowed a creation of an abatement fund as an additional remedy. And one reason that the court noted that the court did this was because it noted that the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program did not actually fully address the problem of childhood lead poisoning. There was a lot more to do in that area. And similarly here with the Polluter Pays Act, it's not going to fully address all of the harms of climate change, leaving plenty of work to be done through the courts. It's also similar to the tobacco cases and the state tobacco control program I talked about earlier. So the other way that you may hear them talk about double counting is through cap and trade. So they're going to say, well, these companies already pay into cap and trade, and so it's so unfair to them, blah, 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 whatever. So I guess I should be a little more sympathetic to these large multinational corporations, but we think that the Polluters Pay Act is completely different from cap and trade Because cap and trade is a market-based program whose purpose is to incentivize future emissions reductions from a wide variety of industries, whereas the Polluters Pay Act seeks recompense for damage caused by past emissions because fossil fuel companies have evaded responsibility to remedy the harm caused by their emissions, and Californians have never been made whole. The fossil fuel industry has profited at about $2.8 billion per day for the last 50 years, but they've imposed their pollution burden on California. So like lead gas and paint, like hazardous waste, like compensation for black lung, it's both reasonable and necessary to ask the fossil fuel companies to pay their fair share to clean up some of the damages caused by their products. And cap and trade is also designed to be a declining fund over time as the cap goes down and companies reduce their emissions in theory, even as we know that climate costs are going to rise. Finally, there's also only a handful of companies subject to cap and trade that are also likely to be subject to polluters pay, and those would be the huge multinational corporations. Next slide. So a couple of the other, just really quickly, these arguments that you might hear: it violates due process because of its retroactive liability. That is not true. Due process just ensures that government acts fairly, not arbitrarily or oppressively, when it deprives an individual of life, liberty, or in this case, property. And numerous cases have held that retroactive liability for environmental harm is constitutional, meaning not arbitrary or oppressive and reasonable, as long as a state can show legitimate legislative purpose furthered by rational means. And courts have upheld that have unanimously found that CERCLA is pollution remediation under CERCLA is legitimate government purpose, and it's totally rational to impose liability for the costs upon parties that created and profited from activities that caused the pollution. This is about as low of a bar as you can get. Courts might also look at whether it's really disproportionate or whether the companies could have known they would be regulated. And here we think that it is proportionate because it's proportionate to their emissions. And also that fossil fuel companies have known, as we said, since the 1950s about the damage that their products are going to do. And since 1990, they should know that they would be regulated. That's where California's AB 32, Global Warming Solutions Act, requires reducing emissions to 1990 levels. IPCC was established in 1988 and released its first assessment in 1990. And 1990 is when the UN General Assembly launched negotiations on a framework convention on climate change. The next one is the Commerce Clause, which is a constitutional provision that ensures that states don't burden interstate commerce. But to show a Commerce Clause violation, they have to prove that the law discriminates against out-of-state industries. So some examples might be taxes only on out-of-state goods, or milk has to be pasteurized within a certain distance of the state. Now, the Polluters Pay Act does not distinguish between in-state and out-of-state parties, so it would not violate the Commerce Clause on these grounds. It would also not excessively burden other states or interstate commerce as compared to local benefits. Here, we know that the monetary and non-monetary benefits of the state, as Claire was talking about, are enormous when compared to the small percentage of their massive profits the world's largest companies might have to pay to remedy just some of the damages to the state. Finally, they've also raised that the Clean Air Act preempts this type of law. Well, no court has ever held that a state polluter pays statute is preempted by federal law. And polluter pay laws don't interfere with the Clean Air Act statutory scheme. They're actually created pursuant to the state's police powers, which gives state authority to legislate to protect the health and safety of residents. And unlike the Clean Air Act, the Climate Superfund Act is not an emissions reduction law, and the Clean Air Act is not a polluter pays law. On top of that, the US Supreme Court recently struck down EPA's greenhouse gas rules for power plants. And we know that this EPA plans to retract all of the climate laws that it possibly can. And so it would be really, really hard to argue that this would be preempted by the Clean Air Act. So those are some of the major arguments that the fossil fuel industry has raised, and you may have heard that I just wanted to address.
Maya, there was a good point in the chat by Pam. Is this meant to say it does
Oh,
not?
yeah, thank you.
Does
Can you
not,
change
okay.
that?
Yes, we will before we share them out, but thank you, Pam.
Great, thank you, yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Maya. I have so many questions and everybody else does too. But this was a really awesome overview. And I am excited to open it up. We have about 10 minutes for discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing. And what we would love is if people could raise your hand, and then I'll call on people as best I can in the order that you raise your hand, and then come off mute. So a round of applause again for Claire and Maya. And yeah, we'd love to have a discussion. Eric, I saw yours first, so go ahead. The floor is yours.
Hi, this is Eric. I'm, hold on, let me, I'm calling in from a different computer because my mic does not work on that computer. But I was wondering if we could get a detailed breakdown of where the money goes from this Superfund Act, like specifically, like how will this benefit directly like wildfire victims per se, and how will it bring down, like, say, their insurance cost or help them with rebuilding homes or things like that, like just more specifics on that exactly.
It doesn't.
No, it doesn't. And in some ways that's good because we really do want community involvement in deciding how to make what's important and how to help, bring what to the table in terms of what needs to be done. But it's a good question, but right now we don't even know the amount of revenue that's going to be raised, even though you've heard an estimate. There are estimates flying around, and the cost assessment will be really important.
Yeah, right now, it basically, it says, look, state, look at the damages. Tell us what the damages are, tell us what the costs are, and then come up with a list of kind of expenses they're called qualifying expenses that could be like types of projects that could decide or that could help remedy some of those damages. So we have options of things that it could, we have some suggestions of things like it could be used for zero emissions infrastructure, potentially it could be used for emergency response if you're in have a wildfire, and for first responders, could be used for schools, for air filtration and air conditioning, things like that. So it's really kind of a gamut. And so we're asking Cal EPA, when it does its study, to sort of take a look and see, like, what are the things that we think could really help the state move forward dealing with the climate damages.
Right, and let me just add that we want to ensure that the health benefits from the related to the cost that came from the emissions and the air pollution is part of that assessment. So I know that there is a group of people from the health community really working hard on that, including Ashley, to make sure that we understand part of the assessment is on the cost of health damages. And then people I know have written a lot in the chat about jobs, but let me tell you, even if you don't put in a bill the prevailing wages and equivalent jobs and so forth, when you actually implement how to spend the revenues, the government's at the table, and they always require prevailing wages and other ways to make the jobs have benefits and adequate wages. So that it's a lot of these things may not be in the bill, but we have ways and a history of how to ensure that the public and labor have a stake in what's happening.
Let's go to, okay, I'm doing my best to be fair here. So we're gonna go Todd, Joan, Kate, Ashmu, Tom, and then Margot, and that might be all. So Todd, you're next up.
Yes, when a compensatory charge has been
Boy, yeah.
determined and is sent to a multinational, which probably isn't headquartered in California, let alone the United States. Shell Oil, for example, is headquartered in London. How does California ensure they pay the bill? What leverage does the state have for multinationals that have no footprint, literally, corporately, in the state?
So so the law requires that they have to have had some connection to the state. So they could be selling their product in the state, they could be advertising the state, they could be lobbying in the state. We know that Shell has done all of those things, and that allows California to assert jurisdiction over companies that might be headquartered somewhere else. Will we have a jurisdiction over Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco? I don't know, Russian state companies or something like that. There are definitely going to be companies where California just does not have jurisdiction, or does not have the ability to go after them. But
So we have jurisdiction, but how do you make them pay the bill? Do you say, since you advertise here and you're not paying your bill, you cannot advertise anymore, and we're going to fine you every time we see a Shell sign up? What's the leverage?
yeah, I mean, there are enforcement mechanisms built in. Like if you don't pay, you're fined, or you have to pay more, or we can deregister you as doing business in the state. So there's mechanisms.
That's deregistering to operate in a state sounds like a good place. And thank you.
Yeah, good question, Todd. And then we're going to go to Joan and then Kate next.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for this. It's super interesting. I've been involved with the campaign for Make Polluters Pay, and one of the arguments that keep coming up that we're grappling with are things that you've been addressing here. So this argument that prices will go up at the pump, and the issue around jobs. So I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the jobs issue, because labor really is kind of split on this. There are a few unions that are in support, but then there are other really major ones that have not stepped up. And we're finding that many of the key legislators they're paying a lot of attention to their labor constituents. So I just wonder if you have any other advice or information about effective ways to talk to the legislators about the issue of jobs. And I don't quite understand whether there's anything in the legislation that would require the companies to pay for job training, or whether that again would fall on the state employment development department. Is that yet another externality? But those of us in the campaign have to massage this information into bites.
Right.
that
Yeah,
we
we're
can
running
use,
out
so-
of time, so let me really quickly address this and maybe
Yeah.
give Ashley something that she could share with you. Because my research team has done a study of the wages that are paid both in the extraction fields, the oil wells, and at the refineries. And let me tell you, labor really exaggerates how many jobs have really good high-paying wages. Many of them are contract workers with bad wages. And the number of jobs that are high wage aren't that great. And many of those people are ready to retire. And so a lot of the discussions that I have with lawmakers is we think that not only locally, the refinery should be setting up refinery retirement jobs and so forth. And so there are a lot of ways that we can talk about this, but let me just tell you, anytime you hear this, ask for the evidence, because they greatly exaggerate the number of highway jobs, and then they try to throw in all these indirect jobs that don't have high wages, and any economic development could replace them. So I understand that's a problem, and let me see if I can share something with Ashley that she could share with you. That we've written at UC Berkeley about sort of the distribution of jobs and what they look like, because I know it's important. And you cannot ever ask the building trades to do anything in the climate, nothing. They will never do that. And they just speak for big oil.
There's a historical relationship there between the building trades and big oil, and they just will not budge, even though they actually would benefit probably the most of any labor union out of this bill.
Yeah.
It's really just disgusting, honestly.
We need more of these conversations, and I wish we had more time, but we're gonna keep going on the questions. So Kate,
Yeah. Hi.
you have-
I was on the Berkeley City Council and we passed a climate equity fund, which did require labor standards. And the building trades did support our bill. So I don't think it's inevitable they don't support things. But the question I wanted to ask is about what economic studies have been done of the impact of local government of climate. Because what we need to be saying to these legislators is, you may pay for it today, or you pay for it tomorrow. And we know what the impact is locally for us. We need to know if there are studies or things that show that impact. Also, the impact on the stock market of declining revenues from these industries, other kinds of economic costs. Is there any more data that we can have on that? Because I found that when I was meeting with legislators last week, that was an effective thing to say to them.
Yeah, no, I agree that it's really important to talk about the climate damages and also bring up public health problems in your communities when you talk to lawmakers. Unfortunately, we don't have direct cost estimates at the county level, and we won't. The cost estimates that we'll get will most likely be by type of disaster, and some of it well, but it's usually covering broader areas than a lawmaker's district. But that doesn't mean that you can't talk about the damages that you know you're experiencing, and there will be more revenues to help, first of all, clean up and then mitigate, and also really focus on public health problems also.
So I'm going to do something a little out of order because I know other people might have obligations at 1:30. So we're going to share the opportunities to connect if you want to collaborate in the wealth of opportunities to make progress on this in California this year. And then if you can stay on, hopefully if our speakers can a little bit more afterwards, but I just want to make sure everybody knows how to connect in for helping move this forward in California. So always passing the hat, getting in the practice that Climate Health Now is a nonprofit, and if anybody has any money burning a hole in your pocket, we're happy to help. Please, thank you. And how can you join in? So there's 3 immediate ways to join in the big community that needs to get bigger, working to pass this type of policy in California. The first is tonight, actually, a lineup on Monday. So at 5 o'clock tonight, Theo Lequesne, who is an amazing person and organizer with the Center for Biological Diversity, he's hosting a Zoom meeting. It's a grassroots organizing call, and everybody's welcome to join. So it's imperfect because I don't have a calendar invite, but you have the Zoom link for tonight at 5. So everybody's welcome to join that. And Theo is going to share, opportunities to collaborate in a very granular, applied way, you could say. So that's number 1. Does anybody want to join? Could you raise your Zoom hand if you want to join that? Well, no, sorry, don't do that. Raise your real hand if you want to join tonight with Theo. Let me see who we got. Okay, so we would love for you to join, and it's really meaningful to be with people who care about this also. So that's number 1. Thank you. Number 2 is tomorrow, there's going to be 4 amazing climate scientists who are speaking about climate attribution science, what it is, how it works, how we apply it to identify responsible parties for destroying our planet. And that is going to be actually in person at UC Berkeley and on Zoom. So that's tomorrow at 11 is another opportunity, the climate attribution science webinar, to get more educated on that side of this work. That's another. And then the third one, unfortunately, the third option is limited to people who are in the health community, which Climate Health Now defines as public health, healthcare administrators, acupuncturists, dentists, doctors, nurses, anybody who identifies as being in the health community. We would love you to join our polluter accountability team meeting, which is on Wednesday at 5 p.m. And Amanda, thank you, is dropping all the links to these opportunities in the chat. So if you're in the health community and this speaks to you and you want to help, we would really love for you to join that meeting on Wednesday. Phew. Okay, so those are the ways to plug in, and we hope you do. And now I'm going to go back to the questions. So in the interest of time, we're just going to take the 3 questions that we already had asked, or hands. So Ashmu, Tom, and then Margot.
Hi, I appreciate it. Joan really took my big question, which was about like trade unions, but like a quick one is how are communities, it keeps getting talked about communities getting to like pick.
Ashmu, I think you might have blocked out for a second. How are communities? And then it froze.
How do communities get involved?
Sorry, it broke up for me again.
Okay.
You put it in your chat?
Get involved and
Yeah.
How are communities able to get involved? Oh, just to check, is it how communities get to decide how the money is spent? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Do you want to take that, Claire, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's really important to know that the 40% are going to the most at-risk communities, and they're already working on how to set that up to deal with it. The rest of the money, we're going to have to actually, I think it's really important to work closely with your lawmakers, and that's when you all can look at the assessment study and see to what extent the damages are there, and really work like we do with everything that goes on that's passed in California. You have to work directly with your lawmakers and their staff to prioritize how resources are spent. And we even see that now happening with the budget. So we have a lot of work to do, not just in passing the bill, but then in actually implementing the bill. But that's always true. First we pass, and then we continue to work on implementation. And I think the medical community really needs to work on the health side.
Yep. Thank you, Ashmu. Great question. And then we'll go to Tom.
Yeah, I think this part went over my head a little bit. We talked about the reasons why gas prices and these oil companies shouldn't. There's no logical reason that costs should go up. But in terms of actually preventing them from taking whatever action they want to take in the short term to scare the hell out of the public in terms of increased prices, is there anything that actually legislative prevents them from doing that? And I think you might have addressed that, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but I don't put anything past conglomerates like this to take whatever action they need to take to send a message.
Right. There's actually been a study that shows how unbranded gasoline competition keeps branded gasoline prices much lower than they might be if the market were not competitive. It's actually a competitive market. And I want to remind you that all gas stations buy their gas from refineries in California at the rack. They all buy it from the same rack. So they're all paying the same price at the rack, with maybe a little bit added on because it's of the ingredients that are proprietary. So think of it as a competitive market, which it is. And if you want to know more about it, let me know and I'll send you a reference or two.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Tom, it went over my head too. I have to hear it like many more times because this is really complex. And I think that's part of our challenge is that, this is not simple messaging, and what the oil lobby is messaging is simple. But our job as organizers wanting to be successful is to make it more simple. So I think that's what I'm hearing as part of the opportunity is to make Claire Brown's PhD level analysis a one-pager, that can be simpler, because that's what we need to win. So I'm glad we're connected. Okay, next we're going to go to Margot. And that'll actually be our last question for today. Margot, I see you, but I can't hear you. Do you have a question still? Yeah. No? Okay. Okay, so then I can't hear you, so I apologize, but we're gonna go to who? Francis's question. So Francis asked in the chat, if refineries all leave California, what will we do? And then we'll end with that.
So I was just plunking that into the chat, and Claire can talk about whether their threats are real or mostly bullshit, but like there's a lot of reasons why refineries might choose to leave California. And it's not primarily regulation, which they say, and it's obviously not this bill because this bill has not been passed. And then the reality is we are going to need to transition off of fossil fuels. These refineries are going to leave. Where are we going to get the money for that? Where are we going to be? How are we going to be able to plan for this? Like, it's worse if they just leave and we have no plan and we have no investment for the workers and things like that. So like, let's start thinking about it and let's start investing now.
Well said.
Yeah, and let me just say in the meantime, our refineries here, like Chevron, they've spent an enormous amount of money to actually be able to process the world's worst oil, because the oil from California fields is dirty and sour and heavy oil. And the thing is, now we love having dirty, sour oil come in. We import 75% of our crude oil, and we get it from oil fields that are known to be dirty and sour because that's cheap. And then once you refine it, all the gasoline and diesel is priced the same on the market. So we've already restructured and spent a lot of money at our refineries to actually have them enabled to process dirty oil. So they buy it cheap and sell it at the regular high market price. So there's a lot of incentive for these refineries to stay in California as long as they can. And meanwhile, we definitely need a plan because we want to phase them out. And by the way, even though they export the oil to other states and countries, remember, we, the public, are paying the social cost of all the emissions that are going on.
So on that note, super grateful to our speakers, Claire and Maya, for sharing your understanding with us. And may we all, break it down and get the message out to bring more people into the fold to pass this legislation. So I really hope that you will take one of those invitations to, link arms and join us in the next steps. There's so much opportunity for work. It's amazing. And yeah, grateful for you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.